You may think that the only difference between the FX30 and the A7S III is the sensor size, FX30 being APS-C and A7S III being full frame. But if you do a little more digging, you'll find out that these two cameras are very different. Which begs the question, which one of these two cameras is right for who? Sony markets the FX30 as a cinema camera and the A7S III as a hybrid shooter. And I've owned the A7S III for over a year and a half as my main A-cam for YouTube videos, client work, headshots, and A-roll. But I did pre-order the FX30 and I'll explain to you why later in the video. I'll be the first to admit I was pretty disappointed when Sony released their firmware update for the Sony FX3, which included log shooting modes like Cine EI, LUT import, and timecode sync, which now makes the FX3 and FX30 a lot different than the A7S III. In one swoop, they separated both cameras and now the argument is settled. But I do still hope for some of those upgrades on the A7S III. But now all of those things that you can find on the Netflix-approved FX3, you can now find on the FX30. With that being said, we're going to cover the similarities and differences between the FX30 and the A7S III so that you can make a better informed decision on which camera is right for you today on the Film Alliance. The first thing I want to mention that I haven't heard a lot of people talk about is the FX30 is APS-C. So that means the lenses that you're going to buy for it are a lot cheaper than buying full frame lenses like you would do for the A7S III. So that means you can buy more lenses and you can also use full frame lenses maybe that you are using on your full frame cameras. So when it comes to lenses, the FX30 is more cost effective. Now let's start off with the similarities. Both cameras have a Bionz XR processor and dual base ISO. Although the dual base ISO is different, the FX30 comes in at 800 and 2500, whereas the A7S III comes in at 640 and 12,800. Both cameras can shoot in 4K up to 120 and 1080 up to 240. But when shooting in 4K 120, the FX30 does have a small 1.6 crop, and the A7S III has an even smaller 1.1 times crop. I've used the A7S III many times on 4K 120, and I hardly even noticed that 1.1 times crop. But with the FX30 having a 1.6, you are going to notice it. Now both cameras can shoot in 422 10-bit. Both are Sony E-mount, they both have the same batteries, both have 5-axis in-body stabilization, both have the same max shutter at 1/8000, both accept the same memory cards, and neither have built-in flash. Both also have a full-size HDMI out, and both have microphone and headphone ports for monitoring your audio. Both have fully articulating touchscreen LCD displays, which are 3 inches. But the FX30's display will be superior to the A7S III because it has 2.36 million dots, whereas the A7S III only has 1.4 million dots. Now you'd probably only be able to tell a difference between these two different displays if you're outside shooting in the glaring sun. I do a lot of shooting outside, so for me, it's a pretty big deal. Both cameras have Wi-Fi and USB, but the FX30 actually has a Gen 2 USB, which will be twice as fast as the A7S III. Both cameras have the same exact sensor, the XMAR-R CMOS, but the sizes are different. The FX30 is APS-C and the A7S III is full frame. Now we're going to talk about the differences, and this is really where you're going to find which one of these two cameras is better for you for whatever it is that you're using. First, we're going to cover the outsides and the ergonomics of the cameras because that's where you really start to see the differences. Like we said in the beginning, the FX30 is really created more for the cinema line, whereas the A7S III is made more for the hybrid shooter. So you're going to get a cooling fan with the FX30 for those longer shoots, so your camera doesn't overheat, whereas the A7S III just has passive cooling. Now with that being said, I've never had my A7S III overheat, and I've shot a lot outside in the glaring sun in 4K 60 and 4K 120, but maybe that's something that will happen to me in the future. I'm sure if you shot in 4K 120 in the blazing sun, then you probably would have heating issues. Also, because the FX30 is a cinema camera, it has 5 different mounting points for things like lights, microphones, and monitors, or whatever accessory that you want to attach to it right out of the box, whereas the A7S III doesn't have any mounting points other than the quarter mount thread that's underneath the camera and also the hot shoe on top of the camera. So you would just have to buy a cage for it if you wanted to build it out to become more of like a cinema rig. If you added the XLR handle unit to the top of the FX30, now you're just creating more mounting points, which means you can build it out even more. And because the A7S III is more of the hybrid shooter camera, it comes with an EVF, whereas the FX30 does not. And I've actually used the EVF when I'm outside and I can barely see my display. I'll just go into my EVF and be able to really properly expose my shot, and I find it very useful. And it's not surprising that the FX30 doesn't have an EVF because it's made first for video, secondary for photography. Of course, there is a big price difference between these two cameras. You can almost buy two FX30s for the price of one A7S III. Right now, the FX30 is selling for $1798 in the US, and the A7S III is coming in at $3498. And that's body only. Speaking about body, let's talk about the weight of both of these cameras. When you include the battery and the memory card, the FX30 comes in at 646 grams and the A7S III comes in at 699. There's not much of a weight difference here, but once you put a cage and a G Master lens and maybe a monitor on the A7S III, it starts to get pretty heavy. So every gram that you can save is less strenuous on your back. Now let's talk about the sizes. The FX30 is a little bit wider, a bit shorter, but more deep. And now let's talk about photography. You would think that because the A7S III, that's made more for hybrid shooters, people who like to do photography and video, would have more megapixel, but you would be wrong because the FX30 has 26 megapixels and the A7S III only has 12, and that's more than half. But when it comes to autofocus, the A7S III comes out on top because the FX30 has 495 focus points and the A7S III has 759. And you'll really be able to tell a difference when it comes to these focus points when you're shooting in low light or maybe your subject is not lit well enough. But when it comes to really dialing in your focus, the FX30 has something the A7S III doesn't have, and that's focus mapping. And that's something that I'm super excited about, be able to use that rather than focus peaking, because it just seems to be like a way better way to figure out what you're focusing on, especially if you're shooting with a lower aperture. The low light performance will definitely be better out of the A7S III because it is a full frame sensor. So now let's talk about picture profiles. Like we talked about in the beginning, that firmware update that Sony released, firmware update 2.0, gave the FX3 those new log shooting modes. And those do come on the FX30s, things like Cine EI. Now the A7S III does have S-Cinetone, but it doesn't have Cine EI. But I find that when you shoot in S-Log3 and you use those dual base ISOs, you're going to get a very similar look than you will to that Cine EI. But I have yet to shoot with Cine EI, that's just from the research that I've done, so I'm excited to test that out. So I think that the FX30 is going to be a smashing hit, especially at the price point that it's at. But as time goes on, I think people will start to understand, like with APS-C cameras, that when they're shooting with higher ISOs, there's going to be a lot more noise compared to like a full frame camera. And that's really where you're going to see the difference and the splitting hairs when you get up there in those higher ISOs. The fact that it shoots in 422 10-bit is a giant step forward for all of us Sony shooters and anybody out there who's in the field, maybe who has full frame cameras and they just need a good solid B cam. It's just really exciting. I did have a couple people who reached out from outside of the United States who are saying that the FX30 is just super expensive right now. I don't know why that is, maybe because of the chip shortage, but I'm sure the prices will come down so that all of us can get our hands on one. So I guess it comes down to the fact that the A7S III is full frame and it has a viewfinder compared to the FX30, which is just an amazing video camera. I think both of these cameras are excellent for weddings. I may just stick with the full frame so that I could have better low light performance out of the A7S III, but the FX30 would be an awesome B cam, especially when you're outside getting some of those slow motion shots. Another thing that we forget to talk about when we talk about both these cameras, especially the storage, is that they have 2 memory slots. And I've definitely experienced in the past when I've gotten home and one of my cards had corrupt files on it, but the other one didn't have corrupt files. So I was able to like wipe my sweat off and just get the other card, and it's crazy how that works. I don't even know, but one card just had a corrupt file on it, and it was pretty important because I don't remember exactly. It could have been a headshot or something like that, and if that happens, then you're in big trouble. So the 2 card slots on both of these cameras are a huge benefit. And the reason why I am picking up the FX30 is because it does offer so much more than the A7S III offers, but I'm still going to use my A7S III as my A cam, and I'll use my FX30 as a B cam. The Sony A7S III is a great choice for people who do hybrid shooting, video, and photography. And the FX30 is going to be a great gateway camera into Sony's cinema line if you're out there doing documentaries or short films, and you really want to understand how that cinema line works so that you can upgrade one day. And not to mention, the FX30 may be Netflix approved, and if you're into making movies that go up on Netflix, that may be something that you're thinking about. So in my opinion, it's a great B cam or an A cam for someone who might be upgrading from the ZV-E10 or the ZV-1. So my question for you is, will you be picking up the FX30? And if you will be, tell me why, because I'm interested to know what your thoughts are. You guys help me out so much in the comment section, and I'm just super excited about the FX30. You let me know what you think in the comments. I'm Joe with the Film Alliance. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video, and until the next one, peace.